Well, good morning. My name is Ted Truman, and it fell to me to organize this panel because I suggested that there be a panel. And Mal Johnson then said, well, why don't you organize it? I thought it'd be interesting to have a group, an array of classes, representatives, people who were in, not necessarily representative classes, talk about some topic of public policy. And I beat the bushes, and these four people signed up to talk about diversity in the United States in all its dimensions. And then they said, I said, shouldn't we have a moderator? They said, no, we're going to moderate it ourselves. So I'm going to turn, after I introduce them, which you can read in your program, but I'll just introduce them briefly. I can turn it over to them. And my only hope is that there will be at least some level of disagreement. If they all agree with each other, you can go home because you don't. But I suspect there'll be some, because we span almost 60 years here. So going from the youngest, if I may put it that way, first, Kendall Ash, who's class of 1918. Wrong century. Julia Jinkia, right? I hope that's close. Class of 2003. Then we dropped down about 50 years to Charles Myers, class of 1988, and Hugh Price of the class of 1963, which is my class. Over to them.
Very well represented.
Wonderful. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. I will kind of be the moderator. Hopefully we'll be able to give a couple of thoughts as well. But as Ted said, I'm Kendall Ash, class of 2018. I'd love to also give a little bit of background on the folks that we have today, what they're up to now, and so you can kind of get some context. So I was class of 2018. I work currently at LinkedIn in our sales department. On campus, I was involved a lot in issues of diversity. So back when Amherst Uprising happened, I was here on campus, and I was also a student representative on the Presidential Task Force on Diversity and Inclusion with President Martin and our former Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer, Norm Jones. So hopefully that lens will help our conversations today, and we'll learn a little bit more about the context of everyone else as well. But our discussion today will be multifaceted. Obviously, the word diversity means a lot of things to a lot of people, and it's a complex issue. So to get started today, I want to ask the panel in front of us, please tell us a little bit about your experience while at Amherst as it pertains to sort of your unique identity. We'd love to start there. Maybe Julie start. Oh, do you want me to start? Is that okay?
Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Kendall, and thank you, Ted, for putting this together. So my name is Julia Jinkia. Like Ted said, my class is 2003, and so what I have worked on for the past 2 decades since leaving Amherst is really racial justice, politics, and equity, but how it applies in public policy. And that came about the first day almost that I entered Amherst College, because I think, you know, at the time in the early 2000s, the country was trying to figure out how to talk about inequality. And, you know, we were talking about it from a class lens, from a gendered lens, not so much from a racial lens, like ironically, but during that era, it really became the place that taught me about activism and taught me how systems work and how to locate where power is. And it's the conversations that I had in every classroom that wasn't teaching me what to think, but how to think. That just made me super critical, super impatient when I saw something not working. And so that became my career. I now look at public policy in the federal landscape and try to figure out which systems were built to exclude people based on race, gender, sexual orientation, basically discrimination, and I go about trying to fix it. And that looks like different things, on the Hill, in the Department of Education, in the White House. But I have decided to focus in on higher ed as a system that is really at the root of so many race relations in this country, but also just opportunity. And so, I'll talk more about what that looks like in my day-to-day, but I credit Amherst with helping me think that, I could be part of the solution when I see something is organized unfairly.
Great. Good morning. Thank you all for coming at 9 a.m. on Saturday, by the way. My entire class is hungover and asleep, or asleep and hungover, because I don't see any of them here, so thank you for being here. I'm class of 88 and proud parent of class of 26. My daughter Charlotte just finished her first year here. We don't call it freshman year anymore, apparently. We call it first year, so I'm respecting her wishes. But she's doing incredibly well and just thriving here, and I'm very proud of her, but also to have that personal connection, another connection to the college is really amazing. I left, when I graduated in 88, I went straight to Wall Street. Went to Solomon Brothers, and after 2 years there, when I was thinking about grad school, instead of going to do an MBA, which is what most of my friends and peers did, I decided to go to Cambridge University in the UK to do an MPhil in history and politics. And I did it because I really wanted to use my brain again academically, and I figured it might be the last chance I actually could, and in fact it was. So I'm really grateful for that experience. I was also a Henry Steele Commager Fellow at Cambridge, meaning I got money from Amherst. Also very grateful again to the college for that. And after I finished my degree, I did my degree in something incredibly, esoteric. It was looking at my thesis, looking at the impact of IMF programs on indigenous communities in the Andes. Totally useless for the rest of my career, but absolutely, I thought it was absolutely fascinating. But after when I was finishing grad school, I, like so many people, had a huge amount of student loans. So I went back to banking, and I've been there ever since. So I've been on Wall Street for 33 years. I've had a great career, vice chairman of Evercore, made it up into the C-suite, ran businesses, and still absolutely love my career, by the way. And so the reason I'm on this panel is because I also, aside from being an investment banker, identify as an activist. I take it very seriously, and my activism really takes two forms that, in my view, are totally connected, which is democratic politics, or the Democratic Party in the United States, but also LGBTQ rights, and was very involved in the marriage equality fight, et cetera. And so when I started on Wall Street, not at Solomon in my first 2 years, because I was like totally intimidated, and I'm a huge proponent of liberal arts education, but I was totally ill-prepared to go work at an investment bank, so I just kind of put my head down. But when I got back to Wall Street after my post-grad, and I came out at Cambridge. Cambridge, by the way, back then was the Yale of the UK. It was the gayest university by far. Like, that was a big deal in the late 80s, early 90s. It was like so gay. And thank God, because it was an incredibly supportive and encouraging environment where you actually could be yourself. But when I came back to Wall Street, I'd made a commitment to myself that I would be out on Wall Street, which back then was really tough. I had no role models. I didn't know what he was, you didn't know anyone. And so, working on a trading floor was, pretty challenging, but I really stuck with it, worked hard, and just put my head down again. And at the end of the day, in the private sector, and especially in places like Wall Street or in financial services, you can be different. As long as you are a top producer, they kind of will let you, do almost anything you want. So I really took that path of being a top producer and worked my way up into management very quickly and areas of responsibility. Once I was in a position of responsibility, I ran a desk of 11 people by the age of 29. I was the youngest on the desk, and I was the head of the desk. So as I moved up pretty quickly, I then made diversity and especially in hiring my biggest priority. And so I always say I was kind of like a one-person DEI machine early on in Wall Street. And if I had to, I'm sure the banks I worked for wouldn't like to hear this, but if I had to make a choice between a straight white male athlete or any other diverse candidate, I always chose the other candidate because that straight white male athlete would have 10 other offers. And so I ended up building the most diverse team. I hired and promoted more women. In today, half my team, half the partners are women. So I'm very proud of that kind of track record. But lastly, just on outside of work, I've been very involved in the Democratic Party. I was one of the co-chairs of Hillary's campaign, presidential campaign in 2016, total disaster. Also very involved in the Obama and Biden campaigns, and very proud of that work. And lastly, I would just say that today, again, with the two I have a full-time job, but also my political activism and engagement seems to be a full-time job as well. But my main priorities are getting more women elected into elected office, higher office, but also members of the LGBTQ community. Today in the United States Congress, there are 15 openly gay or openly LGBTQ members of Congress. All of them are Democrats. Well, Kirsten Sinema is independent now, but essentially sort of a Democrat. It's kind of unclear. But anyway, they're all Democrats except for one, and that's George Santos. So as I always say, and by the way, you guys, they can have him. They can have him, let me just say. And by the way, he lied about everything to get there. He's probably not even gay. We're not even sure if he's gay. So... And we're about to take that seat back, either in a special, and if not, certainly we'll take it back next year. But anyway, it's no coincidence, is my point, that the vast majority of openly LGBTQ members of Congress are Democrats. But at 15, by the way, that represents 2.4% of Congress. We're massively underrepresented still. So are women. And so that's my biggest priority today. And I'm very involved in the Biden-Harris re-elect, and we're going to win the White House again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My experience at Amherst and my view of Amherst was profoundly shaped by my experience growing up. I was born and raised in Washington, D.C., grew up there during the 1940s and 1950s. With the exception of a couple of oases of integration, like the Unitarian Church, where I grew up, and Georgetown Day School, which was a progressive private school, Washington was rigidly segregated when I grew up there. The schools were segregated, the restaurants were segregated. There were only 2 restaurants downtown Washington where black families could eat. Barbershops, you name it. The amusement park just outside of DC called Glen Echo was segregated. Department stores weren't segregated. We could go downtown, buy stuff, but you couldn't try it on in the store. You had to bring it home. When the Brown versus Board of Education decision was rendered in 1954, I was part of the first contingent of black students to integrate the DC schools when I entered Taft Junior High School in the 8th grade. It was a rough and kind of prickly experience, but nothing like Little Rock or anything that we read about in the Deep South. I do recall being hazed while I was there. I was fortunate to make the honor roll, and I'll just tell a slightly off-color anecdote. When they listed my name on the honor roll in the main rotunda, they left the last letter of my first name and the last letter of my last name off of the listing. And just think about what that sounds like. And that became my nickname throughout junior high school. Thank you very much. I then, in 1956, went to Coolidge High School, which is had been a white high school. As part of a very small number of black students to go there. Kind of tough experience. I made friends there. I made enough friends to be elected vice president of our class, but we didn't socialize. No one visited each other's homes. We didn't go to each other's parties. We certainly did not date across color lines, and a black male certainly did not think about approaching a white woman in Washington, D.C. in 1956. You could get hurt badly if you're lucky, and that was all there was to it. I had some experiences which drove home the many manifestations of racism. When I was, this summer between my junior and senior years in high school, I was selected for a program with a defense contractor called ORO, which is for students who were very strong in math and science. I was the first black student ever picked for that. They took it upon themselves to give us a kind of aptitude test and gave us what they thought was our prognosis for life. And I'll never forget being told at age 16 that based on those tests, I probably would get to go to college, but that I should not count on going to graduate or professional school. That's what I was told at age 16. That news really rattled my cage. I went home and told my parents about it. They said, forget about those people, keep moving. During my senior year, I went in to see the guidance counselor at my high school, who was a holdover from the segregation regime. And she advised me to apply to several schools which were several tiers below where I should be aiming. I told her, thank you very much, I don't need advice like that. My parents and I will handle the application process from here. And I never forgot either of those experiences when I got into Amherst and Harvard and Oberlin and Tufts. But that was an early lesson to me about how tests can be interpreted, misinterpreted, and used in malicious ways. I was blessed to come to Amherst. There are many people who were dear friends of my parents and neighbors of my parents, like Dr. Charles Drew, who's the father-in-law of my brother. He was deceased at the time, but my brother's married to his eldest daughter. Dr. Montague Cobb, who was the first African-American to get a PhD in anthropology. They were very illustrious alumni of Amherst and very, very close friends. Dr. Cobb's wife was my 5th and 6th grade teacher, and they were my future wife's aunt and uncle. So there was a lot of legacy stuff working, but I had the SAT scores to get me here as well, and the grades to get me here. I'll never forget Amherst. I remember the education was extraordinary during our Zoom sessions. Many members of the class have reflected on that experience, very, very powerful experience. And I will just tell you, I have a good friend who was part of the group that integrated the junior high school with me, who went on to Harvard in our same class, and he told me he wished he had gone to Amherst. He got a better education at Andover than he got at Amherst. And I said, that's good to hear. Not that I needed to hear, but I thought I'd share it with our classmates. I was stunned by the fraternity experience here. Majority of fraternities, if I'm not mistaken, were either segregated or didn't admit black students. My recollection is something like 8 out of the 13. I did manage to get into a fraternity, but the experience really embittered me. And one of the visits during the rushing period, I had the Animal House experience. I was shown the furnace room and the porch, but not any of the social areas in the fraternity, which was a very clear signal that I was not welcome. It took me, frankly, 20 years to get over being furious with Amherst. I didn't come back to any reunions for a couple of decades. Had another interesting experience which shows you how it was. I was on the baseball team, made it my sophomore year, at least made it enough to get my picture taken with the team in one of those really snazzy baseball uniforms. But as we approached spring training, spring break in the spring of that year, the team was preparing to go south. And this is 1961. The schools they were going to play were white schools in the South. And it occurred to me, I wonder whether I will be able to stay with the team in those dorms, on those campuses, if I make the trip. The second thought I had was, I'm not a starter. I don't really hit curveballs all that well. And I really got a couple of ladies that I'm trying to court really badly. So I have no future as a Major League Baseball player. I hope I had a future as a husband. And I didn't know whether the coach and the team would have my back if we had an incident in the South. So I quit the team. But Amherst was an extraordinary experience. I will say finally that ours, especially among African-American students, but I think generally among students for those who are younger, was sort of the last of the quiescent generation. During our time, there was a lot of student activity in the South, the sit-ins, et cetera. But northern cities, students were pretty quiescent when it came to major issues. There was some activity and protest about the treatment of independents who weren't part of fraternities on campus, and for good reason. But my recollection is that aside from Tim Parsons and probably Jerry Cohen, there weren't too many other students who were very involved in the big social issues of our time. In 1963, the lid blew in the country. You had the Birmingham demonstrations and Bull Connor's attack on the students and the young people down in Birmingham. You had Martin Luther King's jailing, 1963, the remarkable letter from a Birmingham jail. You had the assassination of Medgar Evers, followed by John F. Kennedy's speech about the importance of civil rights, passing civil rights legislation. Then Kennedy, after we graduated, came up to Amherst. My wife and I were here for the groundbreaking, not the groundbreaking, the dedication of the Frost Library. And that was in October, and then 3 weeks later, he was assassinated on my birthday in 1963. Then LBJ came in. The point is, a lot of the energy that reached me and reached many other students was outer directed. We're not terribly focused on whatever the ills of the campus were. There was so much going on in the country, so much wrong, so many causes of social justice that I think those who became active in outwardly directed causes, and that experience actually shaped my own decision to go get deeply involved in civil rights issues and the anti-poverty movement, et cetera. And I'm eternally grateful to Amherst for developing me intellectually, for pushing me to grow, for any students who are participants who don't know. The many members of our class who are here were subjected to the amazing curriculum then. If you don't know, we all were required to take English composition, foreign language, humanities, physics, calculus, and European history. 6 courses. Did not matter what level of preparation you had in secondary school. We all took the cold bath of those 6 courses, and I think it was a challenge and a struggle, but it was an incredible formative experience for which I'm eternally grateful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wow, this is so interesting. I think what's really clear here is that we have a lot of varying experiences, right, with the college, with experiences after Amherst. So for our next, yes? Sure.
I forgot to mention that out of a class of 250, there were 5 black students, 2 of whom dropped out after the first year, so 3 of us finished Amherst. 3 out of 250. And if you look back, that had been the pattern for the previous several generations. The big surge in diversity and inclusion began in the late 60s. Okay, sorry.
No, and that's I think that is related to sort of where I was going to take this. I think a lot of you have mentioned the word activism, both in the context of Amherst, but also in greater society. Before we get to sort of greater society, I think it's important to think a little bit about how we started to find our voice. I think you were mentioning this, a lot of, whether it was externally, influenced or influenced by experiences on campus, a lot of us find our voice, right, in activism or in trying to go towards equity while during our undergraduate experiences. And so I think the next sort of question for you all is, while you were at Amherst, how did you find that voice? I know the word diversity, when I was on campus, we wanted to make sure that it wasn't just a buzzword, right? We don't want to think of it as, are we filling quotas? Are we trying to, do something that's a little bit inauthentic? And that was a lot of the students' grievances when I was here from 2014 to 2018. And so when we think about working towards equity, I think starting with your experiences on campus, I mean, obviously, Hugh had mentioned the few number of black students that were there. You still had to make your experiences there, bearable, right, while you were here, regardless of what was happening sort of outside of campus. So talk to us a little bit about those things that you guys did to strive towards equity while you were here, and then maybe we can talk more about after Amherst.
Sure. I mean, I can start us off. I think about, especially dovetailing right as how you ended, Hugh, about situating, your activism against things that were happening outside of Amherst in the broader world. My experience was actually, I think, diametrically opposite. I was a student coming to Amherst for the first time, as many of us are, living on my own, for the first time seeing the importance of decisions like the food I put in my mouth, the clothes I'm buying, and I was a fundamentally, I mean, I'll say this, but lazy college student at the time. So when I was learning how to, really identify things that seemed unfair to me, I had Amherst as my landscape that I was really focusing on. So my activism actually started by thinking about Amherst's role in the world, when we were learning more and more about sweatshop labor and what conditions looked like around the world, and how Amherst, as a really resourced institution, could make decisions about where we sourced our clothing, right? So this was during the age of United Students Against Sweatshops. I remember we took over Valentine and had a sweatshop fashion show where people got up on the tables, and we got in trouble pretty quickly, but it was a way for us to assert that we all felt like we had a responsibility being here to make Amherst be responsible, as a sort of global institution. And the other form of activism that really stuck with me, and again was the role that Amherst was playing in the world, was when I went to apply for study abroad programs. I was really intent. I'm South Asian. My parents moved to this country in the early 80s, and I was born the first year they came here. I had a very limited understanding of India, except for what my family showed me on our trips. So I really thought, I've been empowered by Amherst for these 2 years, by the time I was a junior, to think critically about the world. I felt empowered to change systems, like I mentioned earlier. I want to go and understand India from my own experience with this education. And Amherst said I couldn't go. And because they really questioned the academic rigor of the program that I was going to. So mind you, at this time, I'm watching. I had seen older friends go to Europe and drink their faces off and get Amherst credit for a semester, and never once were they questioned, to the point where Amherst actually made me submit the CVs of Indian faculty who would be teaching us abroad. And so I went through this system, and I really made it so that I was allowed to go to this one program that was being hosted by the School for International Training, by the way. It's an American accredited university. But in any case, I was told that I was going to be allowed to go as the exception because I had petitions signed, I handed in the CVs humiliatingly, but that no one else would be allowed to go after me, and that I shouldn't make it. I shouldn't make this a cause, because they knew kind of what was at stake here. And so that stuck with me. And I also similarly I was not excited to come back to Amherst for years, because I'd been such a thorn in the administration's side. But I will say now, 20 years out, for the past 6 years, I have served on the board of this amazing center that Amherst has started, called the Loeb Center for Career Exploration and Planning. And I am so proud to be part of that effort at one of the best institutions in the country, because it's setting a model for so many other colleges and universities around the country to say, there is still value in a liberal arts education, and in fact, it's the most valuable education we could be spreading right now, because of everything we're seeing where, people are scared to teach our real history and scared to allow people to think critically. And so I actually want to be an evangelist and get liberal arts more and more out there, and I think efforts like the Loeb Center are exactly why I come back to Amherst now, and I'm really proud about the turmoil that I experienced while I was here, but the fact that we worked through it and that I was still able to accomplish so much, even through that advocacy lens.
Great. I think, so my experience at Amherst, in terms of shaping, not only me academically and in terms of educationally, but, in terms of being an activist and also politically active, it really did start here. And I just want to make a quick observation that, the 90% of these men in these portraits today would not recognize the college. If you just look around this room in these past presidents, they would be, if they're not rolling over in their graves, they would be absolutely shocked that, they presided over an mostly all-white male college, and very privileged, student bodies. So it really is remarkable how much this college has changed. over the course of its life to today. And then from my own experience being here in the mid to late 80s, this was a very homophobic place. Let's be very clear. Any of you that were here in the 80s, or in certainly 84 to 88, know it was overtly homophobic. There were several really well publicized incidents against students. There was some pretty nasty letter writing and articles in the Amherst Student that were blatantly homophobic. It was a pretty tough place. And if you just think about that, from 1988 or the late 80s to, we went from that to up until very recently, an out lesbian president of this college, lesbian of this college. I mean, how incredible, Biddy. I mean, that is incredible progress if you think about it, right? Just in my 35 years since I've graduated, and I think that I'm very proud of that. As part of that progress, the biracial, my daughter's Korean American, biracial daughter of a same-sex couple is a student here. Actually, one of her best friends, closest friends here, is openly trans. I mean, it is really incredible just the progress that's been made here. I'm really, really proud of it. And we still have a lot of work to do here and more broadly out there. And I would argue that a lot of the hard-fought gains that we have made on multiple levels, not just the LGBTQ community, but on multiple levels, is being rolled back and is under serious threat across many parts of this country. I just wanted to make that observation of how much progress this college has made, and yet we would still have a lot of work to do. The last quick thing I would say is my activism, in terms of political activism here, was not only shaped by being, for 4 years, part of a, pretty homophobic environment, which was, traumatizing in a way, but it made me more resolved to fight, I think, for equality. But the second thing is you may, if any of you were here again at that period, in 1984, when I was a freshman or first year, Mondale Ferraro were running, for the White House, and Geraldine Ferraro, the VP candidate, came and spoke at UMass. And I volunteered to do advance for her speech, right, for her campaign. And so I got to do advance work out there, and then I got to meet her. And it was so inspiring to meet the first woman VP candidate, and also just to hear her speech. And I was absolutely totally inspired. So that actually was really the first moment where I had ever done anything politically, in person. And it really motivated me to get much more involved immediately, which I did. And it's been, again, almost, 40 years, 38 years of just nonstop political involvement. I'm really pleased. That was a disastrous campaign, by the way, just to put it out there. Mondale lost in the biggest landslide in American history. He lost every single state except for his own, Minnesota. I mean, that's pretty disastrous. He even lost Massachusetts to Reagan. But it was inspiring to me personally, and I was really proud to play a small role in that campaign. It is interesting how having role models and/or meeting people at work, in an academic environment, just in the world generally, really makes a difference. And I really credit Geraldine, who I then got to know very well personally, a little, later in New York City where I live. Although she passed away, she's a huge hero of mine and a terrific public figure. So I do credit Amherst for that. Quick correction, it's not 15 members of Congress, it's 13, but it is still 2.4% openly LGBTQ. A lot of work to do.
When I was growing up in Washington, many of my parents' closest friends and close neighbors were what I call the first integrators. Many of them were born between 35 and 45 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. And so across the street was the first African American to get board certified in pediatrics. My dad's first cousin was the first African American to get board certified in urology, and my dad was the second. Our neighbor down the street was Charles Hamilton Houston, who was the architect of the school desegregation strategies. Hall of Fame sports writer who advocated for the integration of Major League Baseball. Sam Lacey lived a block from us, and on and on. Many of these people were products of Dunbar High School, which is a very strong academic high school for black students in Washington. They were affiliated with Howard University, and the whole thrust 35, 45, 50, 60 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was to break down the barriers imposed by segregation and to break through to the mainstream. Informed by that, but shaped by a different ethos, when John Kennedy gave his speech, "Ask not what your country will do for you, but what you can do for your country," that reached me very deeply. When LBJ succeeded him and declared that we would end poverty in our lifetimes, I believed him that we would. And I signed up for the war on poverty as a legal services lawyer. And that lens, not breaking through barriers for those who are extremely accomplished and motivated, but widening the access to the mainstream became sort of the focus of my work. Interesting enough to segue to the whole diversity, equity, and inclusion issue, when I became the head of the National Urban League, I was immediately immersed in the great debates over affirmative action. Conservatives were armed and ready and organized back then. We used to have to deal with a book every month attacking affirmative action. I used to spend a lot of time on Fox News going toe-to-toe with Sean Hannity and Bill O'Reilly, and on CNN with Patrick Buchanan on the issue of affirmative action. The first question always was, "Mr. Price, why should a black student who's got lower SATs than a white student get in when the white student doesn't get in? Let's talk about that." And I then explained, having served on the board of the Educational Testing Service, I say, well, tests tell you a lot, but they don't tell you everything you need to know. But it was off to the races, and I learned something very interesting about the affirmative action battles. Yes, it is a principled discussion over how and whether and to what extent race should be included in the calculus and how. But it's also a fierce competition for coveted seats, and let's not have any illusions about that. It is a crass, fierce competition to try to bump some people out of the way so that other people can hold on to, the people on these walls, hold on to those seats and limit the advances of others. Those debates were ferocious, they were fascinating, they were intense, and it became clear to me that once the conservatives amassed enough seats on the Supreme Court, affirmative action like Roe was going to die. It took 25. I was appointed the head of the Urban League almost 30 years ago, but you could see it coming. Race, as I understand the law, and I'm a very lapsed lawyer, is what's called a constitutionally suspect category, and it can only be considered when justified by a compelling state interest. When you think about it, a compelling state interest is a very ephemeral, very difficult to quantify factor. And so who considers what compelling depends on who's making the decision about what's compelling. So the composition of the court 30 years ago was one thing, the composition of the court and what's compelling is totally different. And they now have amassed, conservatives now have amassed enough votes to eliminate it altogether. That decision has the potential to ricochet all over the place. It could impact not just how institutions like Amherst and all the others fulfill their missions, how they manage their admissions processes, but it also could impact hiring, it could impact financial aid and scholarships, it can impact public contracting. It could ricochet all over the place if the consideration of race under any circumstances is declared unconstitutional. The other thing to realize is that there's an army of litigators coming right behind it. Even as the Supreme Court is gearing up to rule on affirmative action and the consideration of race sometime this month, there are already lawsuits working their way through the appellate courts, where there's one in Virginia involving a high school where the system has eliminated the mention of race, has eliminated the consideration of tests, and has said that they will admit all kids who finish in the top 1.5% of all the public schools. Two members of the Court of Appeals have said that's probably okay. One member of the Court of Appeals, a Trump appointee, has said they're ignoring the varnish of diversity. They really intend to admit black students, and that's unconstitutional. So they're reading the minds despite what's on the paper. They're reading the minds. And this kind of litigation is going to be following whatever decision the Supreme Court makes. And it'll be interesting when you look at the mission statements of institutions like Amherst, which want to develop people who live lives of consequence and serve as leaders. Harvard, deeply devoted to diversity, inclusion, and leadership. University of North Carolina, same thing. How and whether and to what extent these institutions can continue the pursuit of their mission in the way they see fit without considering race in a way that makes them vulnerable to the swarm of litigation that will follow is going to be one of the great challenges facing higher education.
Absolutely, and if I can chime in as well a little bit, on my experience with working towards equity, inclusion, belonging, whatever you want to kind of call it in this context on campus, by the time I had gotten to Amherst, right, it was, as Charles had said, a very different campus, I'm sure, than previously in other decades of history. For me, obviously the school was co-ed. From a representation standpoint, as a Black person, there were quite a lot of faces that looked like me. And I remember when I visited the college, I was looking, my father went to Hamilton College. It's not the same, I will say. When I visited when I went on college visits, I remember feeling like I wasn't alone. And actually, Hugh, I attended Sidwell Friends, so we have a bit of a rivalry here. But I also grew up in Washington, D.C. at predominantly white institutions. And so, anyway, Amherst was interesting for me because representationally, by the time I got here, it was fairly good, and we're in the news even today for having one of the highest populations of color at institutions like ours. But for us, it was more than representation. I think that's a good box sort of to check, but it was more about support systems. And so for those who are maybe unfamiliar with Amherst Uprising, it was originally a sit-in that was meant to be 1 hour long in the fall of 2015, started by 3 Black women who were sort of in solidarity with the University of Missouri and with Yale University after some incidents had happened against some Black students on those campuses. They started this sit-in to kind of show solidarity, but what started as an hour-long, sitting in frost to kind of just sit in silence and be in solidarity, turned into a 3-day-long, campaign or opportunity for students of all different backgrounds to come and speak and hear and listen about all of the issues that maybe, a lot of people from different backgrounds didn't even know existed. So it was really interesting to see that, yes, while representation was good, support systems, weren't there. Students felt as though the faculty representation didn't reflect the student body that, was here. Students felt as though, the Board of Trustees didn't reflect the student body, that a lot of the, mental health resources were not catered towards students from lower income backgrounds or backgrounds of color or international backgrounds, you name it. So it was a really interesting experience that, you hear about throughout the years. Representation was a big issue, but for us it was really more about how do we support students from diverse backgrounds to allow them to thrive. And personally, I feel as though, when we work towards equity, when we work towards inclusion, the reason we want to do that is because we want to give people equal opportunity to thrive, right, and to really succeed both at Amherst and beyond. So that was sort of my experience, and hopefully this segues sort of nicely into I want to ask the panel as well about, how do we feel higher education does have, a place in this greater conversation? I know Hugh did kind of allude to the Supreme Court decision around race-based admissions. I also know that recently there was a decision to eliminate legacy admissions here at Amherst as well, and that does influence a lot of communities. And so I'm curious of the panel's thoughts around just higher education, a lot of our experiences right in this space of diversity, and how you feel our experiences, Amherst College, higher education sort of influences the greater conversation around equity or around diversity in the United States.
I'll just say quick, because I want to definitely hear what Charles and Hugh and Kendall think about this too, but on the legacy decision, I just find this interesting. I was talking to some friends about this last night, and it is an incredibly controversial decision. I can see from reactions in the audience right now. And what's interesting is, so I'm coming at this from a very wonky policy perspective, but one of the think tanks that I did almost work at for a decade focused on higher education policy and was really out front in the advocacy campaign to get rid of legacy admissions. Now, I will say that the target of that research was really not meant to be the Amherst colleges of the country, honestly. It was supposed to be higher education writ large. Legacy is a tool that was like putting the thumb on the scale for so many people in the country, right, who higher education had originally been designed for. But when Biddy saw this research and thought about what her tools were at her disposal to disrupt that kind of system, within her purview, she made Amherst a leader in that decision. And I still understand that it's controversial because the idea is that once you make it here, that we should be able to change who else comes in after us, and legacy is seen as that. But I just want to remind people about that thumb on the scale, that to actually get rid of those types of inequities, you have to disrupt a system. And so I just really appreciate Amherst's leadership, specifically on that legacy decision. And I have other thoughts, obviously, about higher ed's role in the country right now, but I definitely want to hear what others say first.
Yeah, I'll just say I support the decision to get rid of legacy. I think, the world is changing, our educational system's changing, equal access, equal opportunity, equal access to education is critical. I actually credit not only Biddy for this decision, but also Tony Marks, President Marks, for really making Amherst needs blind, actually, in terms of financial aid. It was really under his stewardship of the college that Amherst really moved in that direction, which was, I think, also a game changer. And I find this. I have 4 kids, right, who are 16 to 21. Yes, I have 4 teenagers, and I think I'm super progressive and a really cool parent, but they remind me all the time how even I need to adapt and be open to change and including here and we live in Manhattan, so I've raised 4 kids in that progressive bubble, and I always say I've raised 4 socialists. They all supported Bernie Sanders. It just about killed me, and as co-chair of Hillary's campaign. But then even today at dinner, sometimes I have to explain to them that kids, actually we do need the police. We really do. Defunding the police is not a good idea, actually. But they remind me constantly of the need to adapt and to change. And I also look back at the decision to get rid of the Lord Jeff as the mascot, and as controversial as that was as well. And I know these things are hard, right? And I'm 57. Change is hard, but I think we have to embrace all of this change, especially if it's leading to or addressing systemic inequality. I'm a huge believer in it, so I fully support it.
One of the couple of challenging issues among many that will flow from whatever the Supreme Court decides is how do we assess and gauge talent and potential? If you only make that determination based on standardized test scores, you could get the kind of result that Stuyvesant High School in New York City, one of the selective high schools, just announced. They admitted 730 or 40 students based on the tests that they require them all to take. 7 are black, 14 are Latino. If that's okay for the world going forward, fasten our seatbelts. But if you're going to do it differently, then you have to have much more sophisticated and validated means of assessment. I used to serve on the board of the Educational Testing Service, and we always pressed the management to tell us, well, what do the cut scores that the colleges use really tell us? And if the colleges were to admit kids who are just below the cut score by some factor, does that mean that they won't be able to handle the work only in freshman year or later in life? What does it tell you about their future prospects? And the predictive power really does fade rather dramatically, and as anybody who's lived in the real world knows, other factors such as teamwork, drive, perpetual ambition, perpetual learning, hard work, et cetera, begin to count for a whole lot. The other challenge for most institutions will be, just as the selective institutions that are well endowed have quite substantial admissions operations, to make more nuanced decisions about who you want to admit is going to require the consideration of lots of factors, a lot of personal contact, et cetera. And if you have historically relied heavily on tests in order to avoid having to spend money on the admissions apparatus, that's going to have to change if there's going to be diversity, equity, and inclusion going forward. So that'll have major consequences for institutions. So the world is about to change in some very dramatic ways, and it'll be fascinating to see. You look at the mission statement of Amherst, of Harvard's the world, University of North Carolina, the schools that have historically have privileged diversity, equity, and inclusion. Will they continue to make the investment required to make the kinds of nuanced judgments that will be unassailable legally?
Absolutely. I also wanted to add, I think, in the conversation around moving towards equity, the legacy decision as well. The lens that I sort of came at that decision with as well was in the broader scheme of society, of the working world, private sector, public sector, whatever it may be. I work at a company, LinkedIn. We do a lot of research around talent and around how to sort of create the best organizations and hire the best people and all of that. And I think my lens with the legacy decision as well, for those who may be just curious about this perspective, is, it's important to really base decisions off of skills and base it off of not necessarily who you are or who you know, but really based on the skills that you bring to the table. And so I think, I guess it's interesting we kind of agree. I think they were hoping for a little more disagreement on this. But, in terms of the importance of opening doors for people who otherwise would not have been able to get into a certain elite institution, I view it as a positive step in the right direction. Similarly to how, when I was on campus and even after I helped establish a bias response protocol here at Amherst. I don't know, for those who don't know, we used to not have any sort of mechanism for reporting, acts of discrimination or acts of bias or hate speech on campus. And there have been a number of incidents over the last, I guess I could say 10 years, but also all of the years that Amherst has been around. And there was previously no way to sort of speak up about this and have your voice be heard. And especially for those who come from backgrounds who, are underrepresented or don't really have the experience in speaking up for themselves, and especially communities of color and other things like that. It was in my opinion, I was very passionate about establishing systems for those people, again, to go into doors that they previously couldn't have their voices heard, that previously couldn't be heard. And so I think it's a move in the right direction, and just speaking personally. But still a lot of work to be done. So in our last 4 minutes here, maybe we can do a rapid fire, but looking to the future, right? I think this conversation is always about the past, what we have done, what is left to do, but let's talk a little bit maybe about the future and what we believe we can do to continue making strides. So if we can maybe each give like a 1 minute or 1 or 2 minute thoughts around just the future, what strides you'd like to see in either in Amherst or in this kind of greater society. I know that's a large question, but thoughts on that, and then we'll wrap it up.
Sure. We can go in order. So I think, the idea that I would leave the conversation on is that as decisions like the Supreme Court decision are handed down and have the real potential to just shape how higher education operates in this country, but so much more, it can't be seen in a vacuum. I think at the same time, all of these fights around the country in elementary schools for certain books to be banned and curriculum to be scrubbed of our actual history, I think the through line is that people are becoming more and more scared to actually argue and defend their opinions, and we're becoming more and more polarized and entrenched and refusing to hear what other people's ideas could be. And that, to me, brings me right back to my years at Amherst. What I learned to do was fight and defend what I really was starting to see as the way the world made sense. And so I had friends who were incredibly conservative. I mean, maybe by today's standards, they would not be, but, and we argued until we were blue in the face. And those are skills that I took with me into my life. And the idea that my sons are now encouraged to grow up in a public school system that doesn't want them to know about negative things that were part of American history, that to me is so egregious and absurd and anti-intellectual that I just see that as our big responsibility, to not shy away from the ugliness of the past.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, let's call it what it is. The Republican Party has been hijacked by Donald Trump. It is outrageous, the things that people like him, and he's leading in the Republican primary. He may very well win the primary. Might win the White House again. Trump 2.0 is almost unimaginable, really, if you think about it. And then you have people like Governor DeSantis doing all sorts of things in Florida, whether it's book banning, targeting the LGBTQ community, imposing abortion bans, taking on Disney, of all things. I mean, it just is, we have so much work to do. And as I said earlier, a lot of our progress, or some of our progress, is being rolled back as we speak. They're restricting voting rights across the country. I think the Dobbs decision from the Supreme Court is an absolute outrage, no matter almost where you sit politically today. A woman has to have the ability to make that decision with her family, herself, and or her doctor. Absolutely outrageous. And so, as we sit here today, we have a lot of work to do. So I'm pissed off. I'm really, 4 years at Trump was literally lit almost all, certainly my hair on fire. It really is, so what I do, and have done my whole, since even here at Amherst, but beyond, is channel that anger into political action, getting involved in campaigns. You don't have to write a check, you don't have to have money. Just donate your time, get to know your congressperson. And I always say this, if you're a Republican and you went here, chances are you're probably a moderate Republican, I'm guessing. And so also get involved, because I always say if we're going to lose, if the Democrats are going to lose, let's lose to moderate Republicans who actually are high functioning and aren't going to destroy the country, and take away our rights, and take us back 50 years. So get involved too, but I'm very optimistic also. I'm optimistic because, I look at my kids and I look at their friends, and I don't just mean our little progressive bubble in New York and other places. I look at the youth across the United States, and they are so much more politically engaged than my generation certainly was. And part of it's because of Donald Trump. They've been politicized in part by that and all the stuff I just mentioned, but they're so politically engaged and so politically aware. And the good news on young people today is they actually, although they don't identify as either Democrats or Republicans, they often they'll register as independents. What they care about today is issues, and their issues are in this order: climate change, equality, choice, guns, etc. So on every single issue that they care passionately about, they're 100% aligned with the Democratic Party. When they register, and that's our biggest challenge, when they register, they vote Democratic. And so I'm very optimistic. They have a much different view of the world that is so much more forward-looking and progressive. And when I look at them, and they are the future of this country, it makes me incredibly optimistic. And so lastly, I'll just say, I do channel my anger into into campaigns. And I come from a very conservative, my whole family's are Trump supporters. And they always forward me they traffic in conspiracy theories, which are only they'd be amusing if they weren't so dangerous. But I have other friends who forward me who are pissed off and angry about what's happening. And they forward me emails about, have you seen what DeSantis is doing? Have you seen what Lindsey Graham is doing? And I always say, stop forwarding me emails. Just go and get involved in a campaign. Go and knock on doors, help elect more Democrats, help elect more women. Let's get more people of color. Let's get more LGBTQ candidates elected. We'll have a much better country and better results.
I think enough said. I know you want to wrap the session, so amen to all that. Thank you very much for coming out.
Thank you.
Well, you've already gotten one round of applause, but I want to set you up for a second round. As someone who organized this, you exceeded my most extreme expectations, and I congratulate you, especially you, Kendall. You really organized things nicely. You got a great diversity, if I put it that way, of views. I am interested that, speaking for the right end of the right end of the panel, that there's a certain view at the right end of the panel is this, it's going to be very interesting about how you guys manage this in the future, right? Because we're somewhat out of the business. So we're more in the observation phase. But I'm encouraged by what I heard from all of you, and I think you've all given great credit to your alma mater. And it's most, I think, most interesting to say that has been, for each of you, somewhat of a work in progress. And thank you very much.
Thank you.